My name is Daniel, bringing you a new episode of True North News Quick Facts. In this episode, we will be covering the Canadian electoral system. I live in Waterloo, Ontario, and in the wake of Doug Ford's electoral victory, I was having a conversation with a friend about the election. She was excited with the prospect of the new government and proud to have supported his victory. I found myself having to explain that her vote didn't actually go to Ford directly, and since the local NDP candidate was victorious in our riding, her vote didn't actually support anyone currently sitting in Queen's Park. This conversation made me realize that confusion around Canadian elections is very common, and inspired me to throw together this quick explanation of how Canadian elections work and what their faults and benefits are. Canada uses a system commonly referred to as first past the post, but its technical name is single-member plurality. First past the post is used to elect the federal government as well as the governments across all the provinces and territories. Although elections in Northwest Territories, and none of it, vary slightly, as they are based on a traditional First Nation style of consensus governance. Under the first past the post system, the country and each province is split into electoral districts based off of factors such as population as well as social and economic links. These districts are called constituencies, or more commonly referred to as ridings. Canada has 338 ridings across the country. Ontario has 124, Alberta has 87, and so on. All Canadian citizens above the age of 18 are allowed to vote for a candidate in the riding in which they reside, and the candidate that receives the most votes represents his or her party and constituency in the Legislative Assembly. Whichever party wins the most constituencies typically forms government. It is a common misconception that during elections voters are selecting the Prime Minister or Premier directly. While this is the case in the United States, it is not so in Canada. In 2015, only voters from the riding of Papineau voted for Justin Trudeau. In 2011, only voters from Calgary Heritage voted for Stephen Harper. And in 2018, only voters from Etobicoke North voted for Doug Ford. It is therefore important during election time to not only understand which party and leader best represents you in your riding, but also which of the local candidates you most prefer. There are three common criticisms of first past the post: lost votes, strategic voting, and false majorities. Lost votes is the concept I mentioned in the anecdote at the start of the video, in which only voters who support the candidate who wins the riding feel like they've influenced the election. This disenfranchises voters since they feel like they can't affect the final result. So why vote at all? The second major criticism is strategic voting. This is a very common concept in Canadian elections. Strategic voting is basically voting against the party you most dislike as opposed to voting for the party you most prefer. For example, let's say the voter feels most aligned with the platform offered by the NDP, but passionately opposes the candidate from the Conservative Party. If the voter's local race is tight between the Liberals and the Conservatives, with the NDP trailing in third, the voter may choose to vote strategically to avoid splitting the Progressive support, and vote for the Liberals to prevent the Conservative candidate from coming out ahead. This voter is ultimately unsatisfied, as they are forced to vote for a party they do not totally support. This becomes an even more difficult decision if the voter supports one of the small parties, such as the Greens or Libertarians. It breeds cynicism and erodes faith in our democracy. The third common criticism is the concept of false majorities. This is when a party is able to win a majority of seats in the Legislative Assembly without a majority of the vote. For example, both Doug Ford in Ontario and Justin Trudeau federally won majority governments with only about 39% of the vote. Critics argue that this awards a single party with far too much power, without significant support from voters, making first past the post an undemocratic system. It's worth mentioning that majority governments are incredibly powerful in Canada, able to pass legislation without the support of members from other parties. Advocates of electoral reform typically prefer a proportional system, in which the percentage of seats in the Legislative Assembly more accurately matches the proportion of the total vote attained by each party. This would remedy each of the criticisms mentioned. Justin Trudeau was elected with a mandate to reform the electoral system, but like many of his other promises, Trudeau abandoned this one, claiming there was no clear and obvious system to transition toward. First past the post is not without its strength. Ironically, arguably the most prominent criticism of first past the post is also the system's greatest strength. While critics suggest that the system results in unjust, false majorities, advocates say that the elections under first past the post tend towards majority governments. Majority governments are far more productive and stable than minority governments, able to quickly and easily pass legislation. While critics suggest that this is an unjust and undemocratic amount of power, majority governments under first past the post do still have substantial support. typically representing roughly 40% of the voters. Conversely, minority governments, commonly elected under a proportional system, tend to be unproductive, unrepresentative of the platforms they were elected on, due to compromises made in coalition agreements, and less stable, due to votes of no confidence in which a key piece of legislation, such as a budget, is overturned by the opposition, sending Canadians back to the voting booths. What do you think of Canada's electoral system? Let us know in the comments. And as usual, like and share if you enjoyed the video. And subscribe for more interesting Canadian political content. I'm Daniel Tyree, and from all of us here at True North News, stay informed, friends.